The crisp autumn air carried the scent of magnolias as Margaret Blackwood stood on the veranda of Cypress Hill Plantation. At 45, she was no longer the belle of Natchez, but her patrician features and steel-gray eyes commanded respect throughout Adams County, Mississippi. The year was 1851, and Margaret had been a widow for precisely 3 years. The death of her husband, Colonel James Blackwood, had not diminished her standing. If anything, it had crystallized her resolve to maintain the Blackwood legacy at any cost. "Miss Margaret, the new girl has arrived," said Esther, the house servant who had been with the family since Margaret's wedding day. Margaret nodded without turning. "Have her wait in the back parlor. I'll see her shortly." The plantation's 200 acres of cotton fields stretched before her, white bowls heavy on their stems like snow on a winter landscape. 28 enslaved persons worked those fields, but Margaret's mind was on one in particular, a 16-year-old girl named Lily, recently purchased at the Forks of the Road Market in Natchez. Inside the house, portraits of Blackwood's past lined the central hallway. The most prominent was of Thomas, Margaret's only son, who had died of yellow fever at 22. The painting captured his angular jaw and the imperious gaze he had inherited from his mother. Beside it hung a smaller portrait of Elizabeth, Margaret's daughter-in-law, who had perished in childbirth along with her infant just 6 months after Thomas. Margaret paused before these portraits, her face impassive. To the outside world, she was the picture of Southern dignity, bearing twin tragedies. Few understood the desperation that consumed her. The Blackwood line, traced back to Virginia aristocracy, would die with her unless she took extraordinary measures. In the back parlor, Lily sat with her hands folded, eyes downcast. She had been told she was fortunate to be purchased for housework rather than field labor, but the stories whispered among the enslaved about Cypress Hill made her doubt her luck. "Stand up," Margaret commanded as she entered. Lily rose immediately, keeping her gaze on the Turkish carpet. "Look at me," Margaret said, her voice deceptively gentle. When Lily raised her eyes, Margaret scrutinized her face, the high cheekbones, the clear skin, the intelligent eyes. She circled the girl slowly, noting her slender build and the shape of her hips. "Do you know why you're here, Lily?" "To serve in the house, ma'am." Margaret's thin lips curved in what might have passed for a smile. "Yes, but you have a special purpose. The Blackwood name requires heirs, and you will help provide them." Confusion flickered across Lily's face, quickly replaced by a dawning horror as Margaret continued speaking in precise, clinical terms. Margaret had a plan, one that would ensure the continuation of the Blackwood bloodline, while maintaining the outward appearance of propriety so valued in Natchez society. "My son-in-law, Mr. Richard Crawford, will visit from New Orleans next month," Margaret explained. "He's unaware of our arrangement, but he will fulfill his part. You will bear a Blackwood heir, and no one will question the child's lineage once certain adjustments are made to the family records." Outside, thunder rumbled across the Mississippi River. The grand houses of Natchez stood as monuments to wealth built on cotton and human bondage, their facades concealing countless atrocities. At Cypress Hill, Margaret Blackwood was about to add another dark chapter to that hidden history, one that would haunt the plantation for generations to come. Richard Crawford arrived at Cypress Hill on a rainy November evening, his carriage wheels slinging mud onto the gravel drive. At 35, the New Orleans businessman maintained the dashing figure that had first attracted Margaret's daughter, Caroline. Their marriage had been advantageous for both families. The Crawfords gained association with the prestigious Blackwood name, while Margaret secured a promising match for her only daughter. "Mother Crawford," Richard greeted with practiced charm as Margaret received him in the drawing room. "Caroline sends her regrets. The journey would have been too taxing in her condition." Margaret nodded, satisfied that her daughter's third pregnancy provided the perfect excuse for her absence. "We pray for another boy," she said. "The Crawford name needs securing as much as our own." "Indeed," Richard replied, accepting a glass of bourbon from Esther. though I find it curious you've summoned me on business matters that couldn't be handled by post. Some discussions require discretion beyond what paper can provide, Margaret said. We'll speak on it tomorrow. Tonight, you must rest from your journey. That evening, as Richard dined on quail and sweet potato soufflé, Lily served at table, carefully coached by Esther on the proper way to attend to a gentleman of Richard's standing. Margaret observed with calculating eyes as Richard's gaze lingered on the young woman, just as she had anticipated. "She's new," Richard commented casually as Lily left the room. "Yes," Margaret replied. "Purchased last month. She shows promise for house service." Later, after Richard retired to the guest bedroom in the East Wing, Margaret summoned Lily to her private sitting room. The girl stood trembling as Margaret outlined what would be required of her that night and in the nights to follow. "But Mrs.," Lily whispered, "Mr. Crawford is married to your daughter." Margaret's hand struck with surprising speed, leaving a red mark on Lily's cheek. "You do not question. You do as instructed. The Blackwood legacy must continue, and this is how it shall be done." In her quarters that night, Lily wept silently as she applied tincture of belladonna to her eyes as instructed, to dilate her pupils and create the illusion of desire. The bitter herbal mixture Margaret had forced her to drink left her disoriented, its purpose to ensure compliance while maintaining consciousness. Meanwhile, in his bedroom, Richard found a note slipped beneath his door, written in a feminine hand that was not Margaret's. "I have admired you from afar. Meet me in the Blue Room at midnight." The note, forged by Margaret but made to appear as if written by Lily, was accompanied by a handkerchief lightly scented with jasmine. As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, Margaret watched from behind a hidden panel as Richard entered the Blue Room. Lily was already there, positioned on the settee as Margaret had arranged her, appearing to wait expectantly, though her eyes reflected only fear. What transpired next was the first act in Margaret's carefully orchestrated plan, a violation sanctioned by the laws of a society that recognized Lily not as a person, but as property, and by a plantation mistress whose obsession with bloodlines had overtaken any vestige of moral restraint. From her hiding place, Margaret observed with cold detachment. This was merely business, the business of dynasty. In 9 months' time, if all went according to plan, a child of Blackwood blood would be born, and Margaret would begin the process of erasing its true origins from history. Outside, the rain lashed against the windows of Cypress Hill as if nature itself protested the sins unfolding within its walls. December brought a sharp chill to Natchez that seemed to penetrate the very bones of Cypress Hill plantation. In the quarters behind the main house, Lily had grown increasingly withdrawn, speaking only when spoken to and performing her duties with mechanical precision. The changes in her behavior did not go unnoticed by the other house servants, particularly Esther, who had served the Blackwood family for nearly 3 decades. "Child, you ain't been right since that Crawford man visited," Esther whispered one evening as they prepared the dining room for Margaret's supper. "What troubles you?" Lily's hands trembled as she arranged the silver. "I can't speak of it, Miss Esther. The missus would—" She stopped abruptly as Margaret's footsteps echoed in the hallway. Margaret entered, her black mourning dress rustling against the polished floor. Though her husband had been dead for 3 years, she maintained the appearance of the grieving widow, a facade that lent her an air of untouchable dignity in Natchez society. "Lily, come to my study after you've finished here," she instructed. "We have matters to discuss." In the plantation office, ledgers and account books lined mahogany shelves, documenting the Blackwood fortune in neat columns of figures. Margaret sat at the desk once occupied by her husband, now her domain where she managed the business of cotton and flesh with equal precision. When Lily arrived, Margaret gestured to a chair opposite her desk. "Sit." Lily obeyed, her body rigid with fear. "Dr. Wilson will examine you tomorrow," Margaret said without preamble. "I've told him you've been suffering from female complaints. He will confirm if our arrangement has borne fruit." Lily stared at her hands. "Yes, ma'am. If you are with child, your duties will be adjusted accordingly. You will be moved to the small room off the kitchen where Esther can monitor your condition. No one must suspect the child's true parentage. Margaret's voice was matter of fact, as if discussing crop rotation rather than a forced pregnancy. "And if I'm not?" Lily dared to ask. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Then Mr. Crawford will need to visit again. We will continue until we achieve success." She paused, then added with chilling calm, "I should mention that Richard himself knows nothing of our arrangement. He believes your attention was freely given. It would be unfortunate if he were to learn otherwise." The threat hung in the air between them. Lily understood what remained unspoken. Any resistance or attempt to reveal the truth would result in severe punishment, possibly sale to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana. The following day, Dr. Wilson arrived in his carriage, medical bag in hand. A respected physician in Adams County, he had attended the Blackwood family for years and owed much of his practice to Margaret's recommendations among the planter elite. "Margaret, always a pleasure," he greeted, handing his coat to Esther. "You mentioned concerns about one of your house servants." "Yes, the girl seems unwell. I fear a female condition that might affect her work performance." Dr. Wilson nodded knowingly. The health of enslaved persons represented financial interest to their owners, nothing more. In a small room off the kitchen, Lily endured the humiliating examination, tears streaming silently down her face as the doctor's hands moved clinically over her abdomen. When he finished, he patted her shoulder awkwardly. There, girl. You'll be fine with rest." In Margaret's study, Dr. Wilson confirmed what she had hoped to hear. "The girl is indeed expecting. I'd estimate about 4 weeks along. With proper care, she should deliver a healthy infant by late summer." Margaret's face revealed nothing, but her hands clasped together tightly on the desk. "Thank you, Doctor. I'll ensure she receives appropriate attention. The Blackwoods have always treated their people humanely." Dr. Wilson nodded, accepting this falsehood without question. The definition of humane was flexible in a society built on human bondage. After the doctor departed, Margaret stood at her study window, watching as afternoon shadows stretched across the formal gardens. The first step of her plan had succeeded. Now she must prepare for the next phase, creating a plausible narrative for the child who would continue the Blackwood name. In her quarters that night, Lily placed her hand on her still, flat stomach, whispering a prayer for the innocent life growing within her, a child conceived in cruelty, but who she already loved with a fierce protectiveness. Somehow, she vowed, she would find a way to spare her baby from Margaret Blackwood's machinations. By February 1852, Lily's condition could no longer be concealed from the other house servants. Margaret addressed this development with calculated efficiency, summoning the household staff to the kitchen one morning before sunrise. "Lily will be confined to lighter duties from now on," she announced. "She is with child, the result of an unfortunate liaison with a field hand who has since been sold. I've decided in my Christian charity not to punish her too severely for this indiscretion." Esther's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. In 28 years at Cypress Hill, she had witnessed countless fabrications constructed by the Blackwoods, and this one carried the distinct odor of falsehood. She glanced at Lily, noting the girl's downcast eyes and rigid posture. "Which field hand, Miss Margaret?" asked Samuel, the elderly butler who had served 3 generations of Blackwoods. "That is not your concern, Samuel," Margaret replied sharply. "The matter has been handled." As the staff dispersed to their duties, Esther lingered beside Lily at the washing basin. "That ain't what happened," she whispered. "I know it, and you know it." Lily's hands trembled as she scrubbed a copper pot. "Please, Miss Esther, I can't talk about it." Esther pressed a small pouch into Lily's apron pocket. "Raspberry leaf. Make tea with it each night. Won't harm the baby, but will keep you strong." She paused, then added, "Whatever she's planning, child, you ain't alone." Meanwhile, Margaret had begun implementing the next phase of her scheme. She wrote to her daughter Caroline in New Orleans, expressing concern about her prolonged absence from Natchez society. Your continued confinement in Louisiana during your confinement raises eyebrows among our circle, she wrote. It would be beneficial for you to return to your family home for the birth of this child. Natchez air has always been kinder to Blackwood women in their time of need. To Richard Crawford, she sent a separate letter hinting at business opportunities that required his personal attention in Mississippi. The cotton market shows promise this season, she noted. A prudent man would oversee his investments directly. As winter gave way to spring, Lily's pregnancy progressed. Margaret monitored her condition with dispassionate scrutiny, ensuring she received adequate nutrition while restricting her movements to the house and immediate grounds. Lily was forbidden from speaking to the field hands entirely, a precaution against any questions about the non-existent father of her child. One warm April evening, as mockingbirds called from the magnolia trees, Caroline Crawford's carriage arrived at Cypress Hill. At 24, Margaret's daughter remained a beauty, though her features had taken on the harder edge of a woman accustomed to maintaining appearances at all costs. Her own pregnancy was advanced, her belly prominent beneath her traveling dress. "Mother," Caroline greeted Margaret with a formal embrace, "I received your letters. Richard will join us next week." "Excellent," Margaret replied, guiding her daughter into the house. "You've arrived at the perfect time. There's much to prepare." In the privacy of the upstairs sitting room, Margaret revealed her plan to her daughter. Caroline listened with growing horror as her mother outlined how Lily's child, if fair-skinned enough, would be claimed as Caroline's own if her actual baby did not survive birth. "Mother, this is madness," Caroline whispered. "You can't possibly—" "I can, and I will," Margaret interrupted. "The Blackwood name must continue. Your brother is gone. Your husband has failed to produce a male heir through 2 pregnancies. We must seize any opportunity Providence provides." "Providence?" Caroline's laugh held no humor. "You call this God's work?" Margaret's face hardened. "Do not question me on this, Caroline. The arrangements are made. You will claim the child as your own if necessary, or you will find yourself cut from my will entirely. Cypress Hill and every acre of Blackwood land will go to charity." The threat struck its intended target. Caroline had been raised to value position and property above all else. Without her inheritance, her standing in New Orleans society would diminish considerably. "What of Lily?" Caroline asked, her voice small. "Once the child is born, she will be sold downriver. A clean separation is essential." In the kitchen below, Lily placed protective hands over her swelling abdomen as she listened to the muffled voices above. Though she couldn't make out the words, the tone told her enough. Her child's fate was being decided by women who viewed her only as a vessel, not as a mother. That night, as the plantation settled into uneasy silence, Lily met Esther behind the smokehouse. The older woman pressed a folded paper into her hands. "My nephew works on the riverboats," Esther whispered. "He can get you north when the time comes. Keep this hidden. When you hear 3 owls call in sequence, that's the signal. Be ready." Lily clutched the paper, hope fluttering in her chest for the first time in months. "But you—" "I'm too old to run," Esther said firmly. "Been here too long. But that baby deserves freedom, and so do you." As they parted, neither woman noticed the shadow that detached itself from behind the garden wall. Samuel, the butler, who had served the Blackwoods faithfully for decades, but whose loyalty was being tested by the horrors unfolding at Cypress Hill. May brought suffocating heat to Natchez, the kind that settled like a wool blanket over the Mississippi River Valley. At Cypress Hill, both Lily and Caroline were in the advanced stages of pregnancy, their bodies swollen and uncomfortable in the relentless humidity. Margaret watched them both with calculating eyes, measuring their progress like a farmer assessing when crops would be ready for harvest. Richard Crawford had arrived as promised, and now divided his time between plantation business and anxious attendance on his wife. Margaret had craftily arranged for him to glimpse Lily on several occasions, noting with satisfaction how his eyes followed the young woman before darting away guiltily. The seed of recognition and complicity had been planted. One evening after dinner, Margaret cornered Richard in the library as he poured himself a generous glass of bourbon. "My daughter's confinement concerns me," she began, settling into a leather chair opposite him. "Dr. Wilson says there are complications." Richard's hand trembled slightly as he raised his glass. "What sort of complications?" "The child is positioned poorly. There is risk to both mother and infant." Margaret paused deliberately. "Should the worst occur, we must be prepared." "Prepared for what, exactly?" Richard's voice had grown hoarse. Margaret leaned forward. "To secure the future of both our families. There are alternatives that Providence has provided." Understanding dawned slowly on Richard's face, followed by a mixture of horror and self-preserving calculation. "You can't mean—" "I mean only that a Blackwood Crawford heir must exist," Margaret said smoothly. "How that comes to pass is a matter of necessary arrangements." Richard drained his glass, his face ashen. "This is unconscionable." "Is it?" Margaret's voice hardened. "More unconscionable than your behavior during your last visit. The staff talks, Richard. Your midnight wanderings did not go unnoticed." The threat hung in the air between them. Richard's reputation in New Orleans society and his standing with his business partners depended entirely on the image of moral propriety he had cultivated. "You arranged it," he whispered, the realization dawning. "That night, the note, it was you." Margaret neither confirmed nor denied the accusation. "What matters now is family," she said instead. "Our shared legacy. Surely we can agree on that." Meanwhile, in the small room off the kitchen, Lily sat with Caroline, an uncomfortable alliance forming between them. Though raised to view enslaved people as property rather than persons, Caroline found herself increasingly troubled by her mother's scheme, not from moral outrage, but from fear of discovery. "My mother is ruthless in pursuit of what she wants," Caroline confided, her hands resting on her distended abdomen. "She always has been." Lily remained silent, folding baby linens with methodical precision. "If my child survives," Caroline continued, "what becomes of yours?" "The mistress says it will be sold," Lily answered, her voice barely audible. Unless my baby dies and yours becomes mine," Caroline finished bluntly. She studied Lily's face. "And if your child has your coloring?" The question hung between them, the unspoken reality that Margaret's plan would only work if Lily's baby appeared white enough to pass as Caroline's. It was a cruel calculus of skin tone that defined countless lives in the antebellum South. "Then, both our children are lost," Lily said simply. Something shifted in Caroline's expression. Not quite compassion, but a recognition of their shared vulnerability as pawns in Margaret's machinations. "My mother will not be thwarted," she warned. "Whatever she intends, she will accomplish." Later that night, Samuel the butler approached Margaret as she reviewed plantation accounts in her study. At 67, he had witnessed the Blackwood family's rise to prominence and knew secrets that spanned 3 generations. "Miss Margaret," he began, his voice betraying none of the turmoil within him, "there are rumors among the field hands about Lily's condition." Margaret's pen paused over the ledger. "What rumors?" "That the father ain't no field hand. That Mr. Crawford—" "Enough." Margaret set down her pen. "These rumors will cease immediately. See to it." Samuel hesitated. "Miss Margaret, I've served your family loyally since before you were born. What you're planning, it ain't right before God." Margaret's eyes flashed. "Do not presume to lecture me on righteousness, Samuel. My concern is for the Blackwood legacy, nothing more. Even at the cost of innocent lives." "No one at Cypress Hill is innocent," Margaret replied coldly. "We all bear our burdens of necessity, you included." The implicit threat was clear. Samuel had his own secrets, including a daughter and grandchildren whose relatively comfortable positions on neighboring plantations depended entirely on Margaret's goodwill. As Samuel withdrew, Margaret turned her attention to a letter she had been composing to the family lawyer in town. Contingency plans needed to be established, documents prepared that would legally recognize any child as a legitimate Crawford Blackwood heir, regardless of its true parentage. Outside, thunder rolled across the Mississippi, heralding a summer storm. In the slave quarters, Esther knelt in prayer, asking for divine intervention in what was rapidly becoming a tragedy of biblical proportions. And in her small room, Lily traced the hidden paper with escape instructions, memorizing every detail while whispering promises of freedom to the child within her womb. The stage was set for a reckoning at Cypress Hill, one that would expose the darkest corners of a society built on human bondage and the terrible lengths to which some would go to preserve their place within it. June arrived with punishing heat and afternoon thunderstorms that did little to break the oppressive humidity. At Cypress Hill, tension mounted as both Lily and Caroline approached their due dates. Dr. Wilson visited twice weekly now, his concern for Caroline growing with each examination. "The child is large," he informed Margaret after one such visit, "and Caroline's frame is delicate. I fear a difficult birth." Margaret nodded, outwardly displaying appropriate maternal concern, while inwardly calculating how this might serve her purposes. "And the girl?" she asked, referring to Lily. "Progressing normally. She's young and strong. I anticipate no complications." This news simultaneously pleased and troubled Margaret. A healthy infant from Lily would suit her plans, but only if Caroline's child did not survive, an outcome she could not openly wish for, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. As the physician departed, Richard approached Margaret on the veranda, his face drawn with worry and something darker, a growing awareness of his unwitting role in her scheme. "We should take Caroline to New Orleans," he said without preamble. "The medical facilities there are no better than what Dr. Wilson provides," Margaret interrupted smoothly. "Caroline stays at Cypress Hill, where generations of Blackwood women have given birth." Richard's jaw tightened. "This isn't about family tradition. This is about my wife's safety and my child's." "Of course," Margaret conceded, "which is precisely why she remains here under my supervision." The tension between them had grown palpable over the weeks since their confrontation in the library. Richard now understood the full extent of Margaret's manipulation, how she had orchestrated his encounter with Lily, how she planned to use the resulting pregnancy if necessary, and how she held his reputation hostage to ensure his compliance. "You will not win this game, Margaret," he said quietly. She regarded him with cold amusement. "It's not a game, Richard. It's survival. The Blackwood name must continue. At any cost? At every cost." That afternoon, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Lily sat in the kitchen garden, harvesting herbs under Esther's supervision. Her advanced pregnancy made bending difficult, but Margaret insisted she continue working until the last possible moment. "The mistress visited the nursery again today," Lily whispered, careful to keep her voice low. "She brought out all the old Blackwood baby clothes, the ones saved for special children." Esther nodded grimly. "She's making ready. Won't be long now." "Miss Esther," Lily ventured, what if neither baby survives?" The older woman's hands stilled on the rosemary she was cutting. "Don't speak such things into existence, child. But if it happens, will she let me go?" Esther's weathered face revealed nothing, but her eyes held ancient sorrow. "Miss Margaret don't let nothing go that she considers hers. Not land, not people, not grudges. That's why we need to be ready." Later that evening, as Lily helped serve dinner to the family, she observed the strained silence between Margaret, Caroline, and Richard. Caroline barely touched her food, her discomfort evident in her pinched expression. Richard drank too much wine, his eyes occasionally meeting Lily's with the mixture of guilt and helpless anger. As Lily cleared the dessert plates, Caroline suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her abdomen. "Mother," she breathed, "I think it's starting." Margaret was immediately on her feet, issuing rapid commands. "Samuel, ride for Dr. Wilson. Esther, prepare the birthing room. Richard, help Caroline upstairs." In the ensuing chaos, no one noticed Lily's own sharp intake of breath as a contraction seized her, except Esther, whose knowing eyes missed nothing. "You too?" she whispered as they hurried to prepare the birthing room. Lily nodded, fear evident in her eyes. "Lord, have mercy," Esther murmured, "both of you on the same night." Upstairs, Caroline was settled into the large bed in the East Wing birthing room, attended by Margaret and her personal maid. Downstairs, Lily was hustled into her small chamber off the kitchen, where Esther would assist her, a stark illustration of the divide between mistress and slave, even in the universal experience of childbirth. As night fell and the storm intensified, Dr. Wilson arrived, soaked from the downpour. He was immediately taken to Caroline, while Lily labored in relative silence, biting down on a folded cloth to muffle her cries. The hours crawled by, punctuated by thunder and the occasional shout from upstairs. Shortly after midnight, Esther left Lily briefly to fetch more hot water and returned with news. "Miss Caroline ain't doing well," she whispered. "The doctor's worried." Lily's face contorted with another contraction. When it passed, she gasped, "And my baby? What does the mistress plan?" Esther shook her head. "Samuel overheard them. If your child is fair-skinned and Miss Caroline's don't make it," she couldn't finish, "they'll take my baby," Lily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Esther, they can't—" "Hush now," Esther said firmly. "Focus on bringing your child into this world first. The rest we'll face after." Around 2 in the morning, as the storm reached its apex, Lily's labor intensified. Esther coached her through the final stages with the skill of a woman who had delivered dozens of babies on the plantation. Just as the clock in the hallway struck 3, Lily gave a final push, and her child slipped into Esther's waiting hands. "A boy," Esther announced, quickly cleaning the infant and checking his features. "And Lord above—" She fell silent, staring at the newborn. Lily struggled to sit up. "What is it? Is something wrong?" Esther wrapped the crying infant and placed him in Lily's arms. "Nothing's wrong with him, but Miss Margaret won't be pleased. This child ain't passing for nobody's but yours." Lily looked down at her son, whose skin was unmistakably brown, bearing no resemblance to the fair-skinned Richard Crawford. Amid the exhaustion and pain, a small spark of hope ignited in her chest. Margaret's plan, at least this part of it, had failed. Upstairs, Caroline's labor continued, her cries growing weaker as dawn approached. Dr. Wilson emerged from the birthing room briefly, his face grim as he spoke to Richard in hushed tones in the hallway. As the first light of morning filtered through the cypress trees surrounding the plantation, 2 distinct realities were taking shape at Cypress Hill, one that would dash Margaret Blackwood's carefully constructed plans, and another that would set in motion events even she could not control. The morning of June 17, 1852, broke over Cypress Hill with an unseasonal chill that belied the summer date. In the main house, Caroline Crawford lay pale and still in the birthing bed, her labor now in its 15th hour. Dr. Wilson's face had grown increasingly grave as he conferred with Margaret in low tones outside the bedroom door. "She's weakening," he said bluntly. "The child is in distress. I may need to make a choice, Margaret." Margaret's face remained impassive, though her hands clenched at her sides. "Save the child if you can," she replied. "The Blackwood line must continue." Richard, overhearing this exchange from his position by the window, turned with fury etched on his features. "That's my wife, your daughter." "How can you be practical, Richard?" Margaret cut him off. "Caroline would want her child to survive." Before Richard could respond, a cry from within the bedroom summoned Dr. Wilson back to Caroline's side. The next hour passed in a blur of activity, with servants rushing up and down the stairs, carrying fresh linens and hot water. Samuel stationed himself at the foot of the grand staircase, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts as he directed the household's efforts. Meanwhile, in the small room off the kitchen, Lily cradled her newborn son, whom she had privately named Isaiah. The infant nursed hungrily, unaware of the significance his appearance held for his mother's future. Esther had bound Lily's aching body with strips of clean linen and now stood guard at the door, turning away curious house servants with firm authority. "No visitors," she insisted. "The girl needs rest." Around mid-morning, a piercing wail echoed through the upper floors of the house, not the cry of a newborn, but the anguished scream of a man in the grip of unbearable loss. Esther and Lily exchanged glances, understanding immediately what had occurred. "Miss Caroline," Esther whispered, making the sign of the cross over her chest. Less than an hour later, Samuel appeared at the door to Lily's room, his expression grave. "The missus wants to see the child," he announced. Esther moved to block his path. "The girl's just delivered. She needs—" "Now, Esther," Samuel insisted, his voice carrying a warning. "She's in no mood for delay." With trembling hands, Lily surrendered her son to Esther, who wrapped him securely in a clean cloth. "I'll go with him," Esther assured her. "No harm will come to your boy." In the upstairs study, Margaret Blackwood stood at the window, her back rigid as she stared out at the plantation grounds. Caroline's body had been moved to the cooling room, where it would be prepared for burial in the family plot. Richard was sedated in the guest bedroom, his grief deemed unmanageable by Dr. Wilson, who had departed after pronouncing both mother and infant deceased. When Esther entered with the newborn, Margaret did not immediately turn. "The child," she said flatly. "Let me see it." Esther stepped forward, carefully revealing the infant's face. Margaret's sharp intake of breath was the only indication of her shock. Isaiah's brown skin and unmistakable features made it clear he could never pass as Caroline's child or as a Blackwood heir. "This is impossible," Margaret hissed, her carefully constructed facade cracking for the first time. "Crawford is fair. The girl is light-skinned. How can this child be so—" She stopped abruptly, realization dawning. During Richard's visit the previous November, several male guests had accompanied him, including Margaret's cousin from Charleston, whose darker complexion reflected distant Portuguese ancestry in the Blackwood line. "The girl was with someone else," Margaret concluded, her voice dangerously quiet. "She's deceived me." Esther remained silent, knowing that any defense of Lily would only inflame Margaret's anger. The truth that genetic heritage could express itself in unpredictable ways would not satisfy a woman obsessed with bloodlines and racial purity. "Take it away," Margaret ordered. "Have Samuel make arrangements for the girl's sale immediately. New Orleans, the farthest buyer he can find." "Miss Margaret," Esther ventured cautiously, "the child is just born. To separate them now will be a mercy compared to what I'm inclined to do," Margaret snapped. "Do not test me on this, Esther. Not today." As Esther departed with the infant, Margaret turned back to the window, her mind already formulating a new plan. The Blackwood line might have suffered a setback, but it was not defeated. There were other possibilities, other young women on the plantation who might serve her purpose. Downstairs, Esther returned Isaiah to Lily's arms, the grave expression on her face conveying the news before she spoke. "We leave tonight," she whispered. "The missus has ordered your sale. There's no time left." Lily clutched her son to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "But I can't walk yet. The birth—" "You must," Esther insisted. "Samuel will help. He's arranged a wagon to take you to the river. My nephew's boat docks at midnight." Throughout the remainder of the day, as Cypress Hill mourned the death of Caroline Crawford, subtle preparations were made in the quarters behind the house. Small bundles of food were secreted away. A homespun blanket was taken from the mending pile to wrap the infant. A crude map, drawn on a scrap of cotton cloth with berry juice, was pressed into Lily's hand. As dusk fell, Samuel entered the kitchen on the pretense of discussing funeral arrangements with Esther. In reality, he confirmed the escape plan in hushed tones. "The wagon will be behind the North Cotton shed at midnight," he murmured. "I've told the night watchman that Dr. Wilson ordered special medicine from town. He won't question your presence." Lily, who had been moved to a pallet on the kitchen floor to recover, listened with her heart pounding. The prospect of freedom, of raising her son beyond Margaret Blackwood's reach, seemed simultaneously within grasp and impossibly distant. At the appointed hour, with the plantation house dark, except for a single light in Margaret's study, Samuel helped Lily into the back of a small wagon, concealing her and the infant beneath sacks of cottonseed. The journey to the river landing was torturous, each jolt of the wagon sending spasms of pain through Lily's still healing body. She bit her lip until it bled, determined not to make a sound that might betray them. At the landing, a small steamboat was moored against the bank, its outline barely visible in the moonlight. A tall man stepped forward from the shadows, Esther's nephew Jacob, who worked as a deckhand. "Quickly," he urged, helping Lily from the wagon. "We cast off in 10 minutes. As Samuel prepared to depart with the wagon, Lily caught his weathered hand in hers. "Why are you helping us?" she whispered. The elderly butler's eyes reflected decades of witnessed injustice. "Because some sins can't be borne in silence," he replied simply, "not even for the Blackwoods." As the steamboat pulled away from the shore, beginning its journey northward toward free territories, Lily stood at the rail, her son clutched to her chest. Behind them, Cypress Hill Plantation receded into darkness, its white columns ghostly in the moonlight. Somewhere in that grand house, Margaret Blackwood plotted her next move, unaware that her carefully constructed world had already begun to crumble. The legacy she so desperately sought to preserve would eventually fall, not through lack of an heir, but through the very system of human bondage upon which it was built. July 1852 brought no relief from the oppressive heat that blanketed Natchez. At Cypress Hill, the days following Caroline's funeral passed in a haze of black crepe and lowered voices. Richard Crawford, hollow-eyed and diminished, remained sequestered in the guest bedroom, refusing all but the most minimal interaction with Margaret. The discovery of Lily's escape had sent Margaret into a cold fury unlike anything the house servants had ever witnessed. Samuel had been publicly whipped, despite his age and long service, when suspicion of his involvement fell upon him. Esther had been spared only because Margaret could not prove her complicity, though the mistress now watched her with hawk-like attention. She couldn't have gotten far, Margaret insisted to the slave catchers she had hired at exorbitant cost. A woman just delivered of a child with an infant. They must be found. The men nodded grimly, pocketing Margaret's advance payment. They had built their reputations on returning fugitive slaves to their owners, often employing methods so brutal that even other slave owners sometimes questioned their tactics. "We'll start with the river," the lead catcher said. "Most likely route north." As July gave way to August, with no word of Lily's capture, Margaret's obsession only intensified. She spent hours in her study, writing letters to contacts throughout Mississippi and Louisiana, offering substantial rewards for information. The plantation's operations began to suffer from her neglect, with the overseer making decisions that should have required her approval. One sweltering afternoon, Richard finally emerged from his self-imposed isolation to confront his mother-in-law. He found her in Caroline's former sitting room, methodically going through her deceased daughter's possessions. "You've destroyed everything," he said without preamble, his voice rough from disuse. Margaret continued sorting through a box of Caroline's hair ribbons, not deigning to look up. "I'm preserving what matters, the plantation, the Blackwood name. At what cost? Your daughter is dead. Your schemes have failed. Even your house servants are turning against you." At this, Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "What do you know of that?" Richard laughed bitterly. "Everyone knows, Margaret. The girl Lily didn't escape alone. She had help from within your precious household. Your control is slipping. Temporary setbacks, Margaret dismissed, though a muscle twitched in her jaw. The girl will be found. Examples will be made. Order will be restored. Richard studied her with something approaching pity. You still don't understand, do you? This system you cling to, it's already dying. Even here in Mississippi there are whispers of change. Foolish talk from northern agitators, Margaret scoffed. Perhaps, but Caroline is still dead. Your grandson is still dead. And for what? Your obsession with bloodlines and legacy? Richard moved toward the door, then paused. I'm returning to New Orleans tomorrow. I'll not be back to Cypress Hill while you remain its mistress. After he departed, Margaret sat motionless among Caroline's belongings, her mind calculating her diminishing options. Richard's departure would sever the Crawford connection, a significant loss of social and financial standing. The continued absence of Lily and her child represented another failure in her carefully constructed plans. Most troubling was the suggestion of internal resistance among her household staff, people she had considered firmly under her control. Meanwhile, far to the north in Ohio, Lily and Isaiah had found temporary refuge with a Quaker family. The journey had been harrowing. 3 weeks of movement mostly by night, guided by a succession of strangers connected to the Underground Railroad. Isaiah had thrived despite the difficult conditions, growing stronger each day, while Lily's body slowly recovered from childbirth. You're safe here for now, assured Ruth Pemberton, the Quaker woman who had opened her home to them. But you must continue to Canada when you're strong enough. The slave catchers are particularly persistent in these border regions. Lily nodded, her eyes constantly drawn to her son as he slept in a makeshift cradle. I dream of her finding us, she confessed. Miss Margaret, in my dreams she comes with men and dogs, and they tear Isaiah from my arms. Ruth placed a weathered hand on Lily's shoulder. That woman has no power here, and soon, God willing, she'll have no power anywhere. Back at Cypress Hill, the first signs of Margaret's crumbling control manifested in small acts of resistance among the enslaved population. Field hands worked more slowly, feigning illness or misunderstanding instructions. House servants became forgetful, breaking valuable china or oversalting food. Each incident in isolation could be punished, but collectively they represented a subtle rebellion that Margaret struggled to suppress. In September, as cotton picking began, 3 field hands disappeared in the night. Unlike Lily's carefully planned escape, their departure seemed spontaneous, triggered perhaps by unusually harsh treatment from the overseer. Margaret ordered immediate pursuit, but the men had vanished into the vast swamplands that bordered the plantation. This latest blow coincided with an unexpected visit from Reverend Caldwell, the Presbyterian minister who served the planter families of Adams County. He found Margaret in the garden, directing the planting of Caroline's favorite roses around a small memorial stone. Mrs. Blackwood, he greeted solemnly, I've come on a matter of some delicacy. Margaret straightened, brushing soil from her black mourning dress. Speak plainly, Reverend. I have little patience for social niceties these days. The minister cleared his throat uncomfortably. There are stories circulating in Natchez concerning your household, specifically the young woman who escaped. Margaret's expression remained impassive, though her fingers tightened on her gardening shears. Runaway slaves are hardly unusual, Reverend, though I'm surprised such matters are considered appropriate for drawing-room gossip. It's not the escape itself, but the circumstances surrounding it, Reverend Caldwell persisted. There are suggestions of improper arrangements involving your son-in-law. For a moment, Margaret's carefully maintained facade cracked, revealing a flash of the rage beneath. Then, just as quickly, her features smoothed into a mask of injured dignity. I'm shocked that you would bring such vile rumors to my home, Reverend, especially as I mourn my only daughter. I meant no offense, he backpedaled. I merely thought you should be aware. Such talk can be damaging to a family's reputation. Indeed, Margaret replied coldly, almost as damaging as a minister who spread such talk by repeating it. As the Reverend departed, visibly unsettled by the encounter, Margaret remained in the garden, the reality of her situation becoming increasingly clear. The carefully constructed world she had built at Cypress Hill, one of absolute control and unwavering adherence to her vision, was fracturing around her. That evening, as she sat alone in the dining room that had once hosted the county's most prestigious gatherings, Margaret made her decision. Cypress Hill would be sold, not immediately, but after sufficient time had passed to avoid appearing desperate. She would relocate to Charleston, where distant Blackwood relations might provide a fresh start away from the taint of scandal that now threatened to engulf her in Natchez. As for the Blackwood legacy she had been so determined to preserve, perhaps it was time to reconceive what that meant. There were second cousins with the Blackwood name, nephews who might be brought into the fold through careful management of her considerable fortune. The direct line through Thomas might be lost, but the broader family could still flourish. Upstairs, in the unused nursery that had been prepared for Caroline's child, Margaret methodically packed away the carefully preserved Blackwood baby clothes, the silver rattles and christening cups that had been in the family for generations. Each item represented a dream now deferred, perhaps permanently. As she worked, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. Margaret turned sharply, expecting to see one of the house servants. Instead, she glimpsed what appeared to be a woman in a white nightdress disappearing around the corner, a figure unsettlingly similar to Caroline. "Caroline?" Margaret called, her voice uncharacteristically uncertain. No answer came, only the settling sounds of the old house. Margaret pressed a hand to her forehead, aware that grief and stress were taking their toll. Yet in the weeks that followed, similar occurrences multiplied. Glimpses of figures where none should be, whispered conversations in empty rooms, the sound of an infant crying from the unused nursery. The servants whispered that Cypress Hill was haunted, by Caroline, by her unborn child, by the countless souls who had suffered under Blackwood ownership. Margaret dismissed such talk publicly, while privately growing increasingly uneasy in the house that had been her domain for decades. By the end of 1852, Margaret Blackwood had listed Cypress Hill Plantation for sale and relocated temporarily to Natchez proper, away from the growing shadows of the house where her ambitions had led to tragedy. The legacy she had so desperately sought to preserve had slipped through her fingers like the Mississippi soil, dark, rich, and ultimately uncontrollable. Winter 1853 settled over Natchez with unusual bitterness, bringing frosts that damaged the camellias and azaleas in the formal gardens of the district's grand houses. In her rented townhouse on Commerce Street, Margaret Blackwood received few visitors, her social standing having diminished considerably in the months following Caroline's death. Rumors continued to circulate about events at Cypress Hill, growing more elaborate with each retelling. The plantation itself remained unsold, its asking price too high for a property now whispered to be cursed. The overseer managed day-to-day operations, reporting to Margaret weekly, though his letters increasingly noted difficulties with the workforce, unexplained accidents, reduced productivity, and a pervasive sense of unease that affected even the most hardened field hands. One blustery January morning, Margaret was surprised to receive a visit from Judge William Forrest, an aging jurist whose family had been aligned with the Blackwoods for generations. His unexpected appearance in her parlor, still wearing his riding coat, suggested urgency. "Margaret," he began without preamble after declining offers of refreshment, "I've come about a matter that cannot wait. There's been a development regarding your former house servant, the one who escaped." Margaret's posture stiffened imperceptibly. "Lily," the judge nodded, his expression grave. "She's been located in Cincinnati, but there are complications." "What complications could possibly matter? The fugitive slave law is clear. She is my property and must be returned." Judge Forrest shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Under normal circumstances, yes. However, there's been a petition filed on her behalf by Ohio abolitionists. They're claiming unusual circumstances. Margaret's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. What circumstances? They allege that the child she bore was fathered by your son-in-law under coercion, that you orchestrated it as part of a scheme to— He paused, clearing his throat, to secure an heir after your son's death. The colour drained from Margaret's face. Preposterous. Who would believe such an outlandish tale? Unfortunately, Richard Crawford has provided an affidavit supporting portions of the account. This revelation struck Margaret like a physical blow. Richard? Impossible. He would never— Grief affects men in unpredictable ways, Judge Forrest said quietly. After Caroline's death, he appears to have undergone a change of heart about many things. His statement doesn't admit direct involvement, but confirms that you had developed an obsession with producing a Blackwood heir by any means necessary. Margaret's mind raced, calculating the implications. Such accusations, especially with Richard's corroboration, threatened not just her social standing but potentially her freedom. There were laws, even in Mississippi, against certain forms of coercion and conspiracy. "What do you suggest?" she asked finally. Her voice carefully controlled. The judge met her gaze directly. "Withdraw your claim to the woman and child. Allow them their freedom. I can ensure the more sensational aspects of the case remain sealed from public record. And if I refuse, then I cannot predict the outcome, Margaret. These are volatile times. The courts in Ohio will be sympathetic to the woman's claims. The publicity alone would be devastating." After the judge departed, Margaret sat motionless in her parlour as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor. The choice before her was stark: relinquish her claim on Lily and Isaiah, effectively admitting defeat, or pursue them and risk public exposure of schemes that even the slave-holding society of Mississippi would find reprehensible. That evening she penned a carefully worded letter to her attorney, instructing him to withdraw all efforts to reclaim Lily. The document contained no admission of wrongdoing, framing the decision instead as a charitable act toward a former servant who had provided exceptional service to the Blackwood family during difficult times. With this final connection to her failed plans severed, Margaret turned her attention to salvaging what remained of the Blackwood fortune and reputation. Cypress Hill was eventually sold at a significant loss to a cotton merchant from Alabama. The proceeds, combined with other Blackwood holdings, provided Margaret with sufficient wealth to maintain appearances, if not her former prominence in society. In the spring of 1854, as Margaret prepared to depart Natchez for Charleston, she received an unexpected letter, postmarked from Canada and written in a careful, schooled hand. "Mrs. Blackwood," it began simply, "you may wish to know that Isaiah grows strong and healthy in freedom. He will be raised to know his worth as a child of God, not as property to fulfill another's ambitions. I have found work as a seamstress and am learning to read and write properly. Perhaps one day, when he is grown, Isaiah will return to Natchez, not as a Blackwood heir, but as his own man. Until that day, I remain Lily Freeman." The new surname, Freeman, was an unmistakable declaration of identity and independence. Margaret read the letter twice before consigning it to the fire, watching as the paper curled and blackened in the flames. 2 days later, Margaret Blackwood departed Natchez for the last time, leaving behind a legacy far different from the one she had envisioned. The grand plantation of Cypress Hill soon passed into the hands of successive owners, none of whom managed to restore its former prosperity. Local legend claimed that the house remained haunted, with servants refusing to enter certain rooms and unexplained sounds disturbing the night. In Charleston, Margaret lived another 12 years, a diminished figure on the periphery of society. She never spoke of Caroline, Richard, or the events at Cypress Hill again. When she died in 1866, the executors of her modest estate found a locked box containing a single item, a small portrait not of Thomas, her deceased son, but of an infant who bore a striking resemblance to him. On the back, in Margaret's precise handwriting, was inscribed a single word: legacy. The portrait was sold among her effects, its significance lost to all who might have recognized it. The Blackwood name, which Margaret had schemed so desperately to preserve, faded from prominence, becoming just another ghost in the complex tapestry of the antebellum South. Meanwhile, in a small but comfortable home in Toronto, Lily Freeman continued raising her son in freedom, her experiences at Cypress Hill transformed into cautionary tales rather than defining traumas. Isaiah grew into a thoughtful young man who would eventually return to the United States after the Civil War, not to claim any Blackwood inheritance, but to help establish schools for the formerly enslaved in Mississippi, a true legacy built on liberation rather than bondage. April 1875. The Reconstruction era was well underway, bringing profound changes to the former Confederate states. Natchez, once the home of the second highest concentration of millionaires in the United States, had weathered the Civil War with its historic district largely intact, but its social and economic structures forever altered. On a mild spring morning, a well-dressed black man in his early 20s stepped off the steamboat at Natchez under the Hill, the rough-and-tumble riverfront district below the city proper. His clothing, a tailored suit of good quality, marked him as someone of means, unusual for a black man in the postbellum South. More striking still was his bearing. Confident, educated, with none of the deferential posture that local whites still expected. Isaiah Freeman, he introduced himself to the carriage driver he hired. I need transportation to Adams County. The driver, an older black man, studied him curiously. You got folks there? Isaiah smiled slightly. You might say I'm revisiting family history. The journey took them past once grand plantations, now fallen into various states of disrepair or reinvention. Some had been divided into smaller farms worked by sharecroppers. Others stood abandoned, their columns listing like the remnants of forgotten temples. The war and its aftermath had rewritten the landscape of Mississippi as surely as it had rewritten its social order. When they reached the turnoff for what had once been Cypress Hill Plantation, Isaiah asked the driver to stop. I'll continue on foot, he said, paying the man generously. I may be sometime. The main house of Cypress Hill still stood, though its former grandeur had faded considerably. Paint peeled from the columns, and sections of the roof showed signs of neglect. The current owners, a northern family who had purchased the property at auction after the war, had converted much of the surrounding acreage to timber rather than cotton, recognizing the changing agricultural economy. As Isaiah approached the house, an older white woman emerged onto the porch, regarding him with curiosity rather than hostility. May I help you? She called. My name is Isaiah Freeman, he replied, stopping at the foot of the steps. My mother once worked here. I hoped I might see the place. Understanding flickered across the woman's features. During Reconstruction, such visits had become increasingly common. Formerly enslaved persons returning to confront their past or search for family members separated by sale or war. I'm Mrs. Elliot, she offered. My husband and I purchased this place in '67. Please come up. This reception, civil, even welcoming, was not what Isaiah had prepared himself for, though he knew the Elliots' northern origins made them atypical for the region. We've made changes, Mrs. Elliot explained, as she led him through the main floor. The original furnishings were mostly gone when we arrived, but the structure remains largely as it was. Isaiah moved through the rooms with a strange sense of déjà vu, not from memory, for he had been only days old when he left this place, but from his mother's detailed descriptions. Lily had made sure her son knew exactly what Cypress Hill represented, both in their personal history and in the broader context of American slavery. The kitchen would have been outside, connected by a breezeway, Mrs. Elliot explained. We've built a new one inside, more practical. And the quarters? Isaiah asked quietly. Behind the house? Mrs. Elliott's expression sobered. "We had them torn down. My husband couldn't bear to look at them. We built new cottages for our workers, paid workers, near the timber operation." She hesitated, then added, "There is something you might wish to see. The family cemetery is still intact, on the hill behind the orchard." Isaiah nodded, thanking her for the suggestion. After declining an offer of refreshment, he made his way along the overgrown path that led to the small cemetery enclosed by a wrought-iron fence. Here lay generations of Blackwoods, their headstones bearing testament to the family Margaret had been so desperate to perpetuate. Near the center stood a more elaborate monument, a marble angel weeping over two names, Caroline Crawford and infant son, 1852. Isaiah stood before it silently, contemplating the woman whose death had, indirectly, secured his own freedom. Had Caroline known of her mother's schemes? Had she been complicit or merely another victim? "I wondered if you'd ever come back." The voice startled Isaiah from his contemplation. He turned to find an elderly black man watching him from outside the cemetery gate, a man so advanced in years that his hair had gone completely white and his back bent with age. "You know me?" Isaiah asked, surprised. The old man nodded slowly. "Known you since before you were born. I'm Samuel. Helped your mama get away from this place." Recognition dawned on Isaiah's face. "Samuel, she told me about you. And Esther. Esther passed on during the war," Samuel said, his voice heavy with old grief. "But she lived to see emancipation come, said it was enough." They walked together down the hill, Samuel moving slowly but steadily, supporting himself with a gnarled cane. He had remained in the area after the war, working as a carpenter, a skill he had practiced in secret during slavery and openly afterward. "Your mama," Samuel ventured. "She doing all right up north?" Isaiah smiled genuinely. "She's well, married a good man, a minister, when I was 10. She runs a dressmaking shop now, taught herself to read and write, then taught others." Samuel nodded with satisfaction. Always knew that girl had steel in her spine. Had to survive what Miss Margaret planned. They paused at the edge of what had once been the formal gardens, now partly reclaimed by native vegetation. Isaiah had come to Natchez not merely to confront the past, but as part of his work with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping to establish schools for the formerly enslaved. Yet this personal pilgrimage held significance beyond his professional duties. "What became of her?" Isaiah asked finally. "Margaret Blackwood." "Died in Charleston during the war," Samuel replied. "Alone, from what I heard. The Blackwood name died with her, more or less. No direct heirs left." Isaiah absorbed this information silently. In his inside pocket rested a letter from his mother, addressed to the current owners of Cypress Hill. It contained no accusations, no demands for reparation, only her account of what had transpired there, a testimony she felt needed to remain attached to the place itself so that the truth would not be forgotten as the physical evidence of slavery was gradually erased. "Miss Margaret, she was obsessed with legacy," Samuel continued, gazing out over the overgrown gardens. "Ironic, ain't it? All her scheming, and the only Blackwood blood that continued was through you, the very child she rejected." Isaiah had never considered this perspective. Genetically, he did carry Blackwood heritage, though not in the way Margaret had intended. His very existence represented both the failure of her plans and their unintended fulfillment. "I don't consider myself a Blackwood," Isaiah said firmly. "I'm a Freeman, by choice and by right." Samuel smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had been. "As it should be. But there's power in knowing your history, all of it. The parts they tried to hide especially." As the afternoon sun began its descent, Isaiah prepared to return to Natchez proper, where he had arranged accommodation for his stay. Before departing, he delivered Lily's letter to Mrs. Elliott, who accepted it with a solemn promise to preserve its contents. "This land has seen much suffering," she acknowledged. "My husband and I can never fully make amends for what happened here before our time, but we can ensure the truth isn't buried." On the journey back to town, Isaiah contemplated the strange circular path his life had taken, born in bondage at Cypress Hill, carried to freedom as an infant, now returning as an educated man to help others rise from the ashes of the plantation system. His mother had transformed her trauma into resilience, her suffering into wisdom that she passed to her son, not as a burden, but as a source of strength. The following day, Isaiah began his official work, meeting with local black community leaders to discuss the establishment of a school. The site they had secured was heavy with historical irony, a former slave auction house at the forks of the road, the very location where Lily had been purchased by Margaret Blackwood in 1851. "We'll build it here," Isaiah declared, standing on ground once soaked with the tears of the enslaved, a place of learning where once there was only despair. One of the elders, a woman who had been enslaved until emancipation, nodded in approval. "That's how we heal this land," she said, "by transforming what was meant to destroy us into something that gives life." Uidi, as construction began on what would become the Freeman Academy, named not for Isaiah, but for the status its students now held, the stories of Cypress Hill Plantation began to emerge from shadows of suppression. Former slaves spoke of Margaret Blackwood's obsession, of Caroline's death, of Lily's escape. These narratives, once whispered in fear, were now documented by Freedmen's Bureau workers and preserved for future generations. Isaiah remained in Natchez for 2 years, overseeing the school's establishment and growth. During this time, he occasionally visited Cypress Hill, developing a cautious friendship with the Elliots and a deeper one with Samuel, whose knowledge of carpentry proved valuable in the school's construction. In his final visit to the plantation before returning north, Isaiah stood once more before the family cemetery. The angel still wept over Caroline's grave, but now Isaiah viewed the monument differently, not as a symbol of the system that had nearly claimed him, but as a reminder that even the most entrenched institutions could not withstand the human spirit's drive toward freedom. Samuel joined him there, as had become their custom. "You know," the old man mused, "Miss Margaret always feared the Blackwood name would die out. Never occurred to her that names don't matter nearly as much as what a person does with their life." Isaiah nodded, thinking of the school now thriving at forks of the road, of the children, black and occasionally white, who studied there, of the future they represented. "Legacy isn't about bloodlines," he agreed. "It's about impact." As they turned to leave, a mockingbird called from the magnolia tree overhanging the cemetery, the same tree that had witnessed generations of Blackwoods laid to rest, that had stood silent witness to Margaret's schemes, and that now shaded the final resting place of a family whose obsession with continuation had ultimately ensured their extinction. In its branches, the mockingbird continued its complex song, incorporating fragments of other birds' calls into its own unique melody, nature's own commentary on how legacies truly endure, not through purity, but through transformation and adaptation. Isaiah listened for a moment, then walked away from Cypress Hill for the final time, leaving the weight of its history behind, while carrying forward the wisdom its darkness had ultimately yielded. The legacy of Margaret Blackwood had indeed continued, though not as she had intended. It persisted as a cautionary tale of how the institution of slavery corrupted not only its victims, but its perpetrators, twisting human connections into grotesque perversions of family and lineage. But alongside this dark legacy grew another, the resilience embodied by Lily, by Samuel, by Esther, and now by Isaiah himself. This alternative inheritance, built on courage and compassion rather than ownership and control, would ultimately prove the more enduring.